Here is a number that has never quite added up. On the 14th of April, 1902, a 26-year-old turned the key on a one-room store in a coal town in western Wyoming. And by the time he shut it that night, the drawer held $41. The histories quote that figure like a triumph. It isn't. Look closer, and it reads like the last page of something, not the first. Because the man behind that counter should not have been there at all. The doctor had already told him his lungs were finished. He had borrowed the money simply to stand in that room. He could not afford most of the goods stacked on his own shelves. So how does a man who was sick, broke, and betting on a town almost nobody had heard of end up with his name over stores in all 50 states? And then, almost exactly 118 years later, watch the whole thing collapse into bankruptcy. That is the mystery. It runs through a lost fortune, a hymn in a dark hallway, and a young clerk named Sam Walton. And it starts here in Kemmerer. Start with a thing that makes no sense. A store that took only cash, in a town that ran entirely on debt, should have died inside a month. This one didn't. To understand why, you have to understand the trap the whole town was built inside. Kemmerer was barely 5 years old when Penney arrived. Coal had been struck in the ground in 1897, and a settlement went up around the mines almost before anyone thought to plan it. 1,000 people, most of them either underground or married to a man who was, and a railroad running straight through the middle, hauling the coal out and the supplies in. The families along that line needed work clothes and dry goods. What they could almost never find was an honest price. Retail then ran on two things: credit and haggling. A merchant would size up whoever walked through his door and quietly set the price to match what he guessed they could pay. The mining company kept its own store and handed out credit like water, which sounds generous until you follow the money. Wages left through one door and came back through another. A man could work an entire season and finish it owing the company more than he had earned. Everyone in town could do that arithmetic. Almost nobody escaped it. This was the world Penney stepped into, and crucially, he did not step into it as an owner. He came as a junior partner. Two older merchants, Guy Johnson and Thomas Callahan, ran a small string of shops under the name Golden Rule, and Penney had clerked for them long enough to earn a piece of the next one. He argued, deliberately, for a town too small to tempt any real competitor, somewhere he could learn every customer by name. His 1/3 share cost $2,000, and most of it was borrowed, some of it from his own wife's father. If the store failed, he was finished before he had truly begun. Their entire life fit into the space over the shop. Then he did the thing the town had never been offered. Before opening, he walked the length of Kemmerer on foot, taking stock of what the place actually lacked. And when he set out his goods, every single item wore one price, marked in plain sight. The same price for everyone who came through the door. No haggling. No credit. If you had the cash, you paid what the tag said. If you didn't, you came back when you could. The method did not begin in Wyoming. To find its source, you have to go back to a farmhouse outside Hamilton, Missouri, and to a father who taught it as something closer to religion than to business. James Cash Penney was named for that father, a farmer who preached on Sundays without pay and ran his household as though comfort itself were a temptation to be resisted. He belonged to a strict Baptist sect, and he believed a boy came to understand the worth of $1 only by being made to earn it. So when James turned 8, he was told that from then on he would buy his own clothes. It was not cruelty. It was doctrine. The boy raised pigs and traded horses and earned what he needed, one small sale at a time, and the lessons set like concrete. Money was a thing to be respected, never assumed. Then his father made one last arrangement on his behalf. He asked a merchant in town to take the boy on and teach him the dry goods trade. James started behind the counter early in 1895. Weeks later, his father died. By the account handed down through the family, the old man said near the end that Jim would make something of himself and then did not live to find out whether he was right. James was 19, and the one man whose approval he had chased his whole life was gone. The counter suited him in a way the farm never had. He was shy at first, and older clerks outsold him easily. But he studied selling the way other men studied scripture, and within a year or two, he was outselling everyone in the store. Selling, he decided, was not a gift a person was born with. It was a craft, and he meant to master it. Then his own body turned on him. A doctor found the early signs of tuberculosis and warned him, in the blunt language of the era, that if he stayed in the damp Missouri air, he would not last. He needed high ground and dry heat. He needed the West. And here is the irony the whole story hangs on. The illness that was supposed to end him is the only reason any of the rest of it ever happened. In 1897, at 21, he left for Colorado with almost nothing and very nearly finished what the disease had started. He sank his small savings into a butcher shop, and the butcher shop failed. What pulled him back from the edge was a clerking job at a small chain nearby, one that happened to be called Golden Rule. The name would have rung a bell. It was his father's pulpit principle, lettered now over a shop door. Johnson and Callahan spotted in him exactly what his first employer had, and in 1899, they handed him their store in Evanston, Wyoming, to manage, $50 a month, plus a share of the profit. That same year, he married Berta Alva Hess in Cheyenne. At 23, he was suddenly answerable for a store and a wife, standing on solid ground for the first time. Evanston prospered under him, and the owners took note. Soon they would put something bigger in front of him, a store he could own a real share of in a town of his own choosing. And you already know the town he picked. Here is the part that should not be possible. In the very years a lesser man would have been flattened by grief, Penney grew his chain faster than any competitor in the country. The explanation is a single structural trick that most retailers never dared to try. Most men who build a chain of stores hire managers to run them. Penney did the opposite. He turned his managers into owners. And he did it because it had been done to him. Johnson and Callahan had made him a partner rather than a hired hand, and it had changed how hard he was willing to work. He never forgot the difference, so he simply ran the same logic forward. A manager who proved himself was not merely promoted. He was given a 1/3 stake in the next store that opened, and a share of everything it earned. Follow the incentives, and the whole machine reveals itself. A man who owned a piece of his store worked it like an owner because he was one. A manager who trained a promising clerk had every reason to train him well, because when that clerk was ready to run a store of his own, the man who taught him took a share of that one too. Good managers produced more good managers. The chain, in effect, grew itself. In 1913, he brought the stores under one name at last, the J.C. Penney Company, and wrote down the principles it would live by, 7 of them in all. Most were what you would expect, about serving the customer and packing real value into every dollar. But the core was a pledge to reward the people who did the work, and every proposed policy faced one final test before it was adopted. Was it fair? And was it honest? If the answer was no, The idea went no further. The following year, he moved the head office to New York, closer to the markets and the makers. By then, the chain had spread far past the coal camps into farm towns and county seats across the middle of the country. There had been 34 stores in 1912. Within 15 years, there would be more than 1,000. But the years that built all of this were brutal to him at home. In the winter of 1910, his wife Berta went into a Salt Lake City hospital for a minor operation and caught pneumonia there. 2 days after Christmas, still in her 30s, she was gone. She had gone in for something small and simply had not come home. Left with 2 young sons and a grief he had no idea how to carry, Penney did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. The endless business of opening stores filled the space she had left, and that is the hard truth buried in the record. The empire of 1,000 partners grew fastest in the very years after he lost the one partner he had actually wanted to keep. By degrees, he began to step back. In 1917, at 42, he set down the presidency and became chairman, handing the daily running of the company to a steady, gifted man named Earl Sams, who had come up through the ranks and knew the business cold. By the mid-1920s, the company more or less ran itself. Sams minded the stores, the partners minded their towns, and Penney, not yet 50, and wealthier than a preacher's son had any right to dream, found himself with time on his hands, wondering what a fortune like his was actually for. But the years that built all of this were brutal to him at home. In the winter of 1910, his wife Berta went into a Salt Lake City hospital for a minor operation and caught pneumonia there. 2 days after Christmas, still in her 30s, she was gone. She had gone in for something small and simply had not come home. Left with 2 young sons and a grief he had no idea how to carry, Penney did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. The endless business of opening stores filled the space she had left, and that is the hard truth buried in the record. The empire of 1,000 partners grew fastest in the very years after he lost the one partner he had actually wanted to keep. By degrees, he began to step back. In 1917, at 42, he set down the presidency and became chairman, handing the daily running of the company to a steady, gifted man named Earl Sams, who had come up through the ranks and knew the business cold. By the mid-1920s, the company more or less ran itself. Sams minded the stores, the partners minded their towns, and Penney, not yet 50, and wealthier than a preacher's son had any right to dream, found himself with time on his hands, wondering what a fortune like his was actually for. Almost everyone knows the stores. Almost no one knows that Penney built a town, a real one, with a charter and a post office, and that this forgotten place holds the key both to who he was and to the debt that would one day destroy him. The answer to what a fortune was for turned out not to be a yacht or a stable of racehorses. It was 120,000 acres of raw pine and scrub in northern Florida. In 1922, Penney and a partner named Ralph Gwynn bought an enormous, cheap tract in Clay County. Florida in those years was gripped by a land mania, and most of the men buying were speculators holding ground only to flip it as prices climbed. That was never his intention. His idea was stranger and more like him, not to spend the fortune, but to plant it. What he built was a farming community run on the same principle as his stores. Instead of renting to tenants, he let farmers work the land and earn a stake in what they grew, the way his managers earned a stake in what they sold. Experts cleared the ground and laid out demonstration plots to prove what the soil could do. An Institute of Applied Agriculture brought in specialists and opened its doors to any farmer who wanted the newest methods. It was the golden rule again, argued this time in soil across 100,000 acres. Give people a fair start, and they will rise to meet it. But the piece he cared about most was not for farmers at all. In 1926 he built, inside the larger settlement, a ring of cottages around a stone chapel raised in memory of his mother and father. The Memorial Home Community, meant for old ministers and missionaries who had given their whole lives to the church and finished with almost nothing. The line back to his own father is impossible to miss. The Reverend Penney had preached for no pay and died with little, and here was his son building rent-free homes for exactly the kind of worn-out country preacher the old man had been. In time, hundreds would spend their last years there. By 1928, the kingdom was as complete as it would ever be. And here is the detail the whole next chapter turns on. Every cleared acre and every prize cow rested on two things: his own fortune and his willingness to borrow against it. He had built an entire world on the quiet assumption that the good years would simply keep coming. There was a little more than a year left. Now the paradox that defines the man's life. When the crash came, the company he had built barely felt it. The man who built it lost everything he owned. Both of those things are true at once, and the reason they are both true is the key to understanding him. The company was almost accidentally crash-proof. It took only cash, so no customer default could touch it. It carried no debt, so no bank could call one in. It sold cheap, useful goods that people still needed precisely when money was tight. While far bigger names folded, the chain kept right on opening stores through the worst of it, passing 1,400 by the middle of the 1930s. And that was its own particular cruelty. The thing he had made was thriving. His name over 1,000 doors, the idea he had bet his life on proving itself in exactly the crisis it was built for. And none of it belonged to him anymore in any way that could save him. Because to pay for Florida and everything around it, Penney had borrowed heavily against his own company stock. Millions of dollars of it. As long as the stock held its value, the loans were safe. And why would a man so careful with a company be so reckless with himself? Because the stock had only ever moved one way. For 20 years it had climbed. Every time he borrowed against it to build another good thing, the rising value covered the debt and left him richer than before. Borrowing had never once cost him anything. He simply never pictured a year in which it might. Then came 1929. Penny stock, which the company had only just sold to the public that year, fell from more than $100 a share to about $13. The banks wanted their money, and the shares no longer came close to covering the loans. Everything he owned was suddenly tied to values disappearing by the day. And here is the joke at the center of it, too bitter to be funny. For 30 years, Penney had preached a single sermon to America: pay cash, and owe no man anything you cannot cover. His stores lived by that rule, and it was saving them now. But the man himself had done the exact opposite. Mortgaged his life's work to the hilt, and the very debt he had spent a career warning against was about to swallow him whole. The golden rule man had become, in the plainest terms, a debtor, and the shame of that may have cut deeper than the loss. What followed was not one dramatic collapse, but a slow bleeding out. Month after month, through 1930, and into the year after, he sat across desks from bankers and sold off pieces of his life. The detail that stings most is what happened to Penney Farms. The whole idealistic experiment had to be broken up and sold, and he let the land go until only a couple hundred acres remained, which he deeded to the retired ministers, so that at least the old preachers could keep their homes. The thing he had built to outlast him was dismantled inside a year. By the time the fall was complete, a man of 56 who had once been worth $40 million owed $7 million he did not have. That much could be counted. What could not be counted was the sleeplessness that came next, the worry that would not switch off, and something deeper underneath, both that he could not even name. The losses themselves he might have survived. What they were doing to him was another matter. Chapter 6. The Man Who Would Not Retire. Now for the comeback that should not have been possible. A ruined man of 56, deep in debt, who not only climbed all the way back, but then refused, for the next 40 years, to stop working. The question worth holding is not just how he recovered the money. It is why, once he had, he kept standing behind a counter into his 90s when he never again had to. The climb took most of a decade, and he made it the only way he knew. One piece at a time. The company kept thriving through the Depression, and as it did, the value of the stock he had managed to hold on to began to climb back. He paid down what he owed steadily, the way he had earned everything since he was a boy, and by the second half of the 1930s, the debt was gone, and much of the fortune had returned. He was wealthy again, but he never again spoke of money as though it were the point. It went where it had always gone, into other people, through a foundation and into churches, schools and young men trying to make their way as he once had. He died on the 12th of February, 1971, in New York, at the age of 95. His friend Norman Vincent Peale spoke at the funeral. He had lived through more change than almost any man alive. Born into a world of horses and coal towns, dead in the age of jet planes and suburban malls, his own name hanging over hundreds of them. By then the company was the 5th largest retailer in the country, past 1,600 stores. The boy who once could not afford his own shoes had built a name known in every corner of America, lost it, and won it back, and he died a contented old man, believing the company he had built would go on forever. For a while, it looked as though he was right. The discount retail model, popularized by Walmart, later became one of the biggest competitive pressures facing J.C. Penney. For a while, after Penney was gone, the company only grew. It reached its greatest size in 1973, with more than 2,000 stores. The discount stores that Walton had helped unleash took the budget shoppers first. Then came online shopping and the slow death of the shopping mall, on which Penney's had staked nearly everything. By 2006, the company was selling around $20 billion a year. Within a decade and a half, that number had roughly halved. In 2011, reaching for a savior, the board responded to pressure from the activist investor Bill Ackman and brought in Ron Johnson, the executive who had built Apple's dazzling retail stores. He swept away the endless coupons and sales that penny shoppers had come to love and replaced them with everyday low prices. Simple, clear, no games. And he did all of it without once testing whether the customers actually wanted any of it. But Penney's customers were no longer frontier miners. They had been trained for decades to hunt for coupons and to chase the small thrill of a sale, and when the sales vanished, they felt cheated and they left. In a single year, the company's sales fell by a quarter, $4.5 billion simply gone. Johnson was out within 17 months, but the damage held. The company that had survived the Great Depression could not survive its own reinvention. The company cycled through chief executives and strategies, none of which worked, losing money almost every year and sitting under close to $5 billion in debt. The end, when it came fast. In early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic shut the doors of nearly every store in the country. And for a company already this weak, it was the final blow. In May 2020, after 118 years, J.C. Penney filed for bankruptcy and was taken off the New York Stock Exchange after 91 years. The store count, more than 2,000 at its peak, had fallen to 846. What remained was bought out of bankruptcy by two of the country's largest mall landlords for around $800 million. And there is one last detail that closes the circle completely. On the list of stores to be auctioned off in the bankruptcy sat a small store in Kemmerer, Wyoming, the Mother Store, the original single room that had opened on the 14th of April, 1902, and had never once closed its doors in all the years since. It had been 118 years since a sick young man rang up $3,341 in that room and let himself believe he could build something that would last. He had been right, and then he had been wrong. And now the proof of both was up for sale.